I'm going to start this video essay with a quote from documentarian Errol Morris, who in 2008 stated that people used to think that the truth should be shot badly. He went on to say that the truth is not guaranteed by natural lighting or a handheld camera. What Morris is referring to here are traits that were particular to what we refer to today as the direct cinema school of the 1960s. A movement that includes filmmakers such as the Miles brothers, D.A. Pennebaker and Frederick Wiseman. These filmmakers believed that in order to capture the truth, the documentarian should remain as unobtrusive as possible. As a result, the filmmakers do not appear in their films, and interactions with subjects are kept to the absolute minimum. Richard Leacock, one of the founders of the DC movement, explains that in DC documentaries there are no interviews, no reenactments, no stage scenes, and very little narration. In short, they wanted to give the viewer the impression that events were unfolding exactly as they would have even if the camera wasn't there, as if the viewer were an unobtrusive fly on the wall, which strangely enough is where the saying originates from. They also liked to use natural lighting, and because they wanted to follow the action closely, many shots were taken with handheld cameras. This, of course, resulted in a loss of quality, which is what Morris refers to as shot badly. Well, a lot of people at the time bought the DC hype, and badly shot and natural light became leitmotifs for truth and authenticity. Today, the shaky camera shot is so overused that it's become a cliche. It's even made a transition to the big screen, where it's used to make the viewer feel closer to the action or as a signifier of the authentic. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you've probably been living in a cave for the last 10 or 15 years. So, armed with their nifty little sync sound cameras, this new breed of filmmakers set forth into the world to capture what Vertov described as Kino Pravda. The French called it Cinema Verite, and in English it translates literally into Cinema Truth. However, what I'm going to argue here is that despite their best intentions and lofty ideals, the DC filmmakers never really came close to capturing anything like the objective truth. In fact, the DC philosophy was deeply flawed and conveniently ignored some fairly critical factors. And as far as Kino Pravda was concerned, the practitioners themselves frequently bent the rules when it suited them in order to tell the stories that they wanted to tell.
No. A flunking student, a flunking student shouldn't receive such accolades as fabulous.
The first issue I'll examine is that of behaviour modification, or how the very presence of the camera can alter the subject's behaviour. It was an aspect of filming which the DC filmmakers failed to address, and one which led to a fair amount of criticism. Professor Colin Young, the former director of the British National Film and Television School, wrote extensively on this particular subject, and he believed that filmmakers should recognise as a matter of fact that the camera alters behaviour. Therefore, under these circumstances, the filmmakers are not capturing the truth, and are instead recording a manufactured reality, one that, paradoxically, only exists due to the presence of the camera. At best, the presence of the camera could potentially do something subtle, like modify a subject's vocabulary. At worst, it can lead to the kind of hammy performances that are found in third-rate pantomimes.
I'm right about these few papers, that's all.
What do you want me to tell you that you're right about these papers?
I want you to say that a girl who receives fabulous and all these marks should flunk.
Young also suggested that given this phenomena, the best course of action open to a filmmaker might well be to participate directly in the filming. One such filmmaker who did just that was the French ethnographer Jean Rouch. Rouch accepted that the camera modified behaviour. In fact, he embraced it, and was critical of what he believed was the American DC school's naive belief that they could capture the truth through passive observation alone. In his 2004 book, Documentary Screens, Keith Beattie points out that Rouch didn't want to film reality as it is, but truth provoked. As far as Rausch was concerned, people were infinitely more sincere when placed in front of a camera, and if they were provoked, either by the camera or by other more direct methods, such as interviews or even covert interference, then the truth could come to the surface. Without this provocation, Rausch contended that all that was left was surface appearances only. Which brings me to the second factor I'm going to examine, that of surface appearances. For example, a man walks into a bar. No, not that kind of a bar. A real bar with drinks and stuff. Now, imagine you're a fly on the wall watching the scene unfold. Essentially, all the information you have is that a man walks into a bar. We may get to see what drink he's ordered and where he decides to stand afterwards, but essentially, that's about it. If he looks uneasy or nervous, that's all we'll know. We won't know why. We have to draw our own conclusions. Now, perhaps his wife has thrown him out, or he's meeting a long-lost love, or perhaps he's gambled away his life savings and just wants to get blind drunk. The point I'm trying to make is that with a purely observational approach, all this information is lost. And I believe that for those interested in the truth, this is a big price to pay for observational purity. I'm going to use a couple of examples from DC movies to illustrate this point further, but before I do, I think it's only fair to hear the director himself explain what he is trying to give the viewer. Sorry, wrong clip. Here we go.
Well, the way I tried to make the films, excuse me, is to give the viewer enough information so they can feel that they're present, and yet at the same time make up their own minds what it is they're seeing and hearing. I don't like films that are didactic or condescend toward the viewer. The only safe assumption for me is that the viewer of the film is as smart or as dumb as I am.
So, Wiseman wants us to make up our own minds about what we're being shown and draw our own conclusions, which is a noble enough sentiment. However, consider this scene from Titicut Follies and ask yourself if we really do have enough information to make an informed judgment. Apart from knowing that these men are either guards or patients in a mental institution, we know nothing else about them at all. We only see what Wiseman chooses to show us. And here it's also important to remember that we're watching an edited version of reality. Just as much truth ended up on the cutting room floor as that which made it into the finished film. I want to switch next to Robert Drew's Primary, which was shot by Richard Leacock and Al Maisels. Here we have a clip of the then Senator John Kennedy, which was taken towards the end of the 1960 Wisconsin primary election, which was the subject of the film. Unknown to the protagonists at the time, this election would turn out to be fairly critical for the destiny of Kennedy, not to mention for America as a nation.
Yeah. 5,078 in the fifth. 5,078.
In this scene, the polls are over, and Kennedy is now at his hotel waiting for the election result. The votes were actually being counted as this was being filmed. Here Kennedy looks nervous and far from confident. He jumps from his chair every time the phone rings. He chews pensively on a half-smoked cigar, and at one point he even turns his back to the camera completely. Now these examples are fairly telling in their own right. However, it's only the tip of the iceberg as far as the truth of the situation is concerned. And I can't help but feel that some key questions from a skilled interviewer could have enhanced the viewer's understanding of the situation and Kennedy's mindset considerably. Drew wanted to capture for posterity a true record of what happened in Wisconsin. It was even part of his sales pitch to Kennedy.
And he said, well, why should I do it? And I said, because this will be a new form of history also. And it'll be a true history of what happened in Wisconsin.
But just as Wiseman failed with Titicut Follies, so did Drew with Primary. Because what we have here is not a true record of what happened in Wisconsin. It's a true record of what was filmed in Wisconsin.
Well, it's a case of if somebody's out there that has actually got Shannon.
So what we're really left with is the documentary equivalent of watching one of those police appeals for information. The ones where we judge the guilt or innocence of someone purely because they may be acting strange or unnaturally in a manufactured situation that's also both strange and unnatural. Mind you, this one does look a bit shifty.
Please let her go. Her family's missing her, all her friends are missing her at school.
The final factor I'll be looking at is called Sins Against Truth, and I've taken the title from a quote made by film historian James Blue, referring to the filmmaking of Albert Maysles. I've chosen this quote for two reasons. First, it sounds massively pompous, and second, because Al Maysles, and nearly all the other DC filmmakers, did in reality commit a great many sins against truth. Remember the doctrine outlined by Richard Leacock? Well, it turns out that it was more of a guideline, really, rather than something that was carved in stone. Now, I'll not spend too much time here, mainly because many commentators over the years have hammered the DC school for its numerous contradictions. For example, Jeannie Hall points out that Drew and Associates used to conduct interviews routinely, and then they would insert them in their films with the interviewer's questions edited out. Keith Beattie highlights how reenactment was used by the Maysles brothers in Salesman, and William Rothman describes D.A. Pennebaker's Bob Dylan documentary Don't Look Back as a performance by co-conspirators. And I could go on. However, my favourite example of DC documentarians manipulating the truth comes from the Maysles brothers and Charlotte Zwerin's 1970 rockumentary Gimme Shelter. And the reason I'm using Gimme Shelter is not because it's a good example of DC filmmakers bending their own rules. It's because of the influence they exerted on the picture even before the cameras started rolling. For those who don't know, Gimme Shelter is the movie of the Rolling Stones' free concert staged at Altamont near San Francisco in 1969. It was supposed to be the Stones' gift to the American people, and it was being billed as a West Coast Woodstock. But far from being another Woodstock, the Altamont concert was a disaster from start to finish, and by the end of it, 4 people would have lost their lives.
They hit Nick. Somebody hit him.
Originally it was planned to stage the concert at a conventional venue. However, negotiations fell through, and with only 2 days to spare, it was relocated to Altamont, a small stock car circuit in the middle of nowhere with virtually no facilities whatsoever. What does this have to do with the filmmakers, you ask? Well, the larger venues wanted the publishing rights to the documentary, rights that were held by the Maysles brothers, Zwerin and the Rolling Stones, and they weren't giving them away. It may have been a free concert, but they still had to get paid. With this in mind, it could be argued that Gimme Shelter was a truth constructed in its entirety by the filmmakers. After all, every inch of footage only exists because of their decision to stage the concert at Altamont.
It's so horrible.
So, what have we learned? As far as behaviour modification goes, it's pretty much accepted as the norm these days. As any episode of Big Brother or I'm a Celebrity will confirm, the camera affects behaviour, full stop. It's a fact of life for the documentarian, but by giving the issue little credence, the DC filmmakers exposed a rather naive assumption, which was easily turned on them by their detractors. Rausch and others criticised them further for essentially giving the audience what they described as surface appearances only, which on balance is also fair criticism. In my opinion, there is rarely in DC movies enough information for the viewer to make a truly informed decision, and the problem is compounded if the subject matter is complex or nuanced, or if it's one from outside the Western cultural experience. And just to hit them while they were down, in the final segment we had a look at how DC filmmakers, willingly and with malice aforethought, circumvented their own doctrine on numerous occasions. This of course smacks of hypocrisy and double standards, and as a result they've been taken to task on this subject many times since their movies were first aired, and quite rightly too. But despite all these contradictions, we are still getting a truth. just not the truth. And this doesn't necessarily mean that they made bad films, far from it. When viewed for what they are, in other words as a truth rather than the truth, they can still be seen as landmarks in the development of documentary film. Unfortunately for Wiseman, Pennebaker and their DC colleagues, aiming for truth had set the bar way too high, and their failure to deliver would ultimately be their undoing. Or to quote Noel Carroll, direct cinema opened a can of worms and then got eaten by them.